Hi everyone, it's Katrina. Number 10. Magellans Giants. In the year 1520, Ferdinand Magellan went sailing around the world. When he arrived in Patagonia on the shores of South America, he discovered the most unusual thing ever found by an explorer. He came across a naked giant dancing on the shoreline and singing a tune. Magellan was so astounded that he ordered one of his emissaries to make contact with the enormous beast. The meeting went according to plan, and the giant received Magellan with open arms. This is all according to Antonio Pigafetta, the man on Magellan's fateful voyage who kept a diary and recorded everything that happened. Antonio wrote that when the giant stood before the crew, he shivered in fear and pointed to the sky. The giant believed the pale Europeans had descended from heaven. The giant was also so tall that the largest among Magellan's men only reached his waist. The crew shared food and drink with the giant, and one of the men showed the giant a mirror. The giant was so shocked at seeing his own reflection that he threw the mirror away and swiped 4 men to the ground in a single blow. Ferdinand Magellan and his crew of sailors spent several weeks with the giant and his tribe of other enormous people. Magellan had also planned to take a pair of them back to Spain to prove his discovery. But according to Antonio's diary, the plan failed when the giants died and were lost on the voyage home. It's unclear exactly what happened to the giants, but they could have caused trouble. The Spanish may have put them down and tossed them into the sea. This sounds like the ridiculous plot of a movie, but experts say it may be somewhat true. Ferdinand Magellan may have encountered the Tehuelche tribe from Patagonia. These were real people of fantastic stature. They weren't 12 feet tall, but they were at least 6 feet and up. According to expert William C. Sturtevant, 19th century scientists estimated the height of the Tehuelche men at roughly 7 feet tall. More modern estimates say they were only 6 feet tall, based on archaeological evidence. Either way, they were huge compared to the shrimpy 5-foot-tall Spaniards. It's also entirely possible that Ferdinand Magellan did see 1 or 2 tribesmen who measured 8 or 9 feet tall. Over the years, the Tehuelche were slowly absorbed or killed by the Spanish settlers and disappeared. To this day, the Tehuelche remain one of the tallest populations in human history. And now for number 9. But first, it's shoutout time! I want to give a big thank you to La Siena C. Branchetti for the super thanks and for supporting this channel. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Number 9. The legendary city of Xanadu. In 1298, the great explorer Marco Polo's book Travels was released in Europe. It was a fantastic book all about Marco Polo's exciting adventures in the East. It was what Marco Polo wrote in his book that gave the West the first true imagery of Asia. There were fabulous temples, smoky opium dens, exotic beasts, and land very much unlike the one in Europe. Marco Polo left his home in Italy and traveled across Asia before arriving in the legendary city of Xanadu around 1275 AD. But he didn't just stay for a few weeks on vacation. Marco Polo remained in the court of Kublai Khan for almost 20 years. And he didn't return to Europe until 1292 AD. In his book, Travels, Marco Polo described a magical city of marble and stone. He wrote about halls and chambers covered in beautiful decoration, as well as massive gardens abound with thriving animals and birds of prey. In the center of the city, he spoke of a great royal pavilion supported by a colonnade of pillars. Many years later, in 1797, English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote another story of Xanadu. In his epic poem, Kublai Khan, he described Xanadu as a vision in a dream. In the 20th century, it wasn't totally clear whether Xanadu was a real place or a mythical location dreamed up by an explorer 800 years ago. But then, its remains were discovered north of the Great Wall of China. Xanadu was, in fact, a real city. So majestic and exotic, it's no wonder Marco Polo never wanted to leave. It was the summer capital of the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan's death. It was built 217 miles from Beijing, and it was occupied from 1274 until 1364 AD. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, ruled the place from 1260 until 1294. And while Genghis typically gets all the attention, Kublai Khan was notable for being the first outsider to conquer all of China. He stomped the Song dynasty into dust and became the first non-Han emperor of China. Number 8. The Blemies. Famous Greek historian Herodotus wrote about a group of creatures known as the Blemies 2,500 years ago. Herodotus said they were creatures with eyes in their chests that had no heads. They looked exactly like humans but didn't have brains, skulls, or faces. They supposedly lived in the thick woodland of Libya. Herodotus also wrote that Libya was full of giant snakes, monstrous beasts with dog heads, horned donkeys, and other atrocities. But 500 years later, a Greek geographer noted that the Blemies lived in Nubia and weren't horrible monsters. They were simply a tribe of people trying to live their lives in peace. Shortly after that, Roman historian Pliny the Elder described them once more as headless humans with mouths and eyes in their chests. Pliny the Elder was arguably the most important of all the Roman naturalists, but he also wasn't that reliable. He once described a race of people with their massive feet nearly as big as their torsos. Then, in the 16th century, the great explorer Sir Walter Raleigh wrote about a strange jungle-dwelling people known as the Panoma. Raleigh described the tribesmen as having eyes on their shoulders and mouths in the middle of their chests. But unlike his predecessors, Raleigh didn't say these strange beings lived in Libya or Nubia. He said they were from Guyana. And if you didn't know, that's all the way on the other side of the world in South America. The only other known piece of evidence that such a people exist comes from the Middle Ages. There is a work called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, which was published in the 14th century. And although the creatures in the book aren't called the Blemies, they perfectly match the description. Mandeville describes these people as folk of foul stature, who were cursed to have no heads. He also says their eyes were on their shoulders. There are lots of accounts of explorers coming across these strange people, but to this day, scientists don't have any proof of a headless race with eyes on their shoulders and a big gaping mouth in the middle of their chest. What do you think all these guys were talking about? Let me know in the comments. Number 7. El Dorado. In the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro was one of the main Spaniards responsible for looting and pillaging South America. He was particularly guilty of helping to disassemble the Inca Empire and steal their riches. Pizarro wasn't the only explorer in the New World in the early 16th century, but he was one of the most ruthless. He and others like him set out on dangerous expeditions in search of gold. They heard rumors from the Inca of cities deep in the jungle so rich with gold, they used it to build their houses. One of the names explorers and adventurers kept hearing was El Dorado. They heard this legendary city's name everywhere, like a whisper in the wind. Every explorer wanted a piece of it, but little did they know that El Dorado wasn't a place, but a tradition. And this was discovered during an expedition in 1537. Ask any expert on Spanish colonialism in the 16th century, and they'll tell you there's no mystery behind El Dorado. The case has been solved for nearly 500 years. In 1537, Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada discovered the Muisca people of Colombia. The Muisca people lived in the highlands just outside modern Bogotá, and one of their traditions was that every time they had a new king, the king would cover himself in gold dust. Then he would jump into the sacred lake Guatavita. It was believed that when the king emerged from the waters, he'd be cleansed of the gold, and the kingly ceremony was complete. El Dorado was what they called this act, and in Spanish it translates to the gilded man, or the man covered in gold. The Muisca people were utterly decimated pretty much as soon as they were discovered. These cities were destroyed and their treasures were looted as they came under Spanish subjugation. The Spanish dredged Lake Guatavita but didn't find very much gold. The conquistadors were so disappointed that they kept the legend of El Dorado alive, stubbornly believing there must be more gold hidden somewhere in the mountains. Number 6. Captain Bartholomew Gosnold. In 2002, archaeologists discovered a mysterious grave on the outside of a fort built on a tiny island in the James River 400 years ago. Investigators were immediately baffled by this. All the other burials found at the ancient fort were cheaply done. The bodies were simply dumped in the ground. But this grave contained a coffin, the only one at the site. The grave was also carefully dug, showing whoever was buried there must have been extremely important. The digging was done by anthropologists with the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. The site where the grave was discovered was the first permanent English settlement in North America, and that, of course, is Jamestown in Virginia. The individual in the coffin was found with a captain's staff, so they were obviously regarded with some reverence by the colonists. An analysis of the artifact showed the grave was made prior to 1630, and an examination of the skeleton proved the dead person was male and stood a little over 5 feet tall. He was also in his mid-30s when he passed away, but there was no obvious cause of death, and although they can't definitively prove it, researchers think that this man was likely Captain Bartholomew Gosson. Bartholomew was an early explorer and one of the first people to die in the Jamestown colony. Only 3 months after the colonists landed in 1607, he got sick and passed away. Bartholomew was one of the biggest supporters of colonization in the late 16th century. He started his life as a lawyer and then became an explorer. He traveled to New England in 1602 looking for the New World. He named Cape Cod after the stunning number of fish he found there, and Martha's Vineyard was named after his daughter. His ship was the Godspeed, one of 3 boats destined for Virginia in 1606. He was also the vice admiral and the man who designed the fort at Jamestown. But for all of his hard work and dedication, the New World killed him. Not even 100 days in North America, and Bartholomew was in a coffin and buried in the dirt. Number 5. The Dinosaur Expedition. German captain Ludwig Lausnitz was the first man to hear about a living dinosaur hiding somewhere in Africa. In the early 20th century, the captain was charged with conducting a survey of German colonies in Cameroon. As he went from colony to colony, he heard about a strange reptile the locals called Mokele Mbembe. Everyone agreed that the creature was a giant lizard monster, and they described it as a prehistoric behemoth. It sounded so big and so frightening that even the German captain was doubtful the reports he heard were true. But still, he thought the tales were credible enough to repeat them. The captain spoke of a monstrosity with brownish skin that was even bigger than an elephant. The creature had a long and flexible neck, almost like a serpent was attached to its body. And according to Ludwig, it only had 1 gigantic tooth, or possibly a horn. Its muscular tail was similar to that of an alligator, but much bigger. Locals were afraid to canoe near the beast, or it would smash their vessel to pieces. It would kill entire groups of men, but wouldn't eat their bodies because it was purely vegetarian. It would also sometimes retreat into caves to sleep, then slink out in the day to feed. The description seems to be that of a dinosaur, some kind of sauropod like a brontosaurus. The issue here is that every dinosaur has been extinct for 65 million years. But this didn't stop adventurers from going in search of Africa's hidden dinosaur. German adventurer Lieutenant Paul Gratz wrote his own account of the beast in 1911. He called the dinosaur Nsanga and said he hunted the creature through the jungle but failed to succeed in killing it. All he found were pieces of its skin on the island of Mbawala. Do you think it's possible there could be dinosaurs still living on the planet? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. Number 4. The 7 Cities of Cibola. The 7 Cities of Cibola is the name of a mythical land that was coveted by Spanish explorers in the 16th century. While it's been compared to El Dorado, these places aren't connected in the slightest. The 7 Cities of Cibola was said to be a district far to the north beyond the land of the Aztecs that was home to untold treasures. Cities of gold the likes of which the Spanish could only dream of. In 1527, the Narvaez expedition met disaster. Spanish conquistador Panfilo de Narvaez traveled to Florida with 600 people on 5 ships. Their mission was to colonize Florida for the Spanish crown. But when they met a storm off the coast of Cuba, their ships sank. Only about 400 people reached the shores of Tampa Bay, but none of them knew where they were. So it seemed best if they divided and tried to find good land to survive in. But unfortunately, pretty much everybody died. As they desperately fought to get a foothold in the wild wetlands of Florida, they perished one by one. Only 4 men from the expedition remained, and they got as far from Florida as they could. They eventually traveled into what is now Texas, where they were captured by the indigenous people living there. Then, after many years of hardship, the captives escaped and arrived in Mexico City. When they got there in 1536, the men began to spread rumors about the 7 cities of Cibola. They'd supposedly learned of the land from the Native Americans whom they'd lived with for the past few years. The 4 survivors never went in search of the cities of gold, but others did. In 1539, Moroccan explorer Esteban and his partner Marcos de Niza strayed far north and wound up in the land of the Zunis. Nobody knows what happened except that Esteban was murdered, and Marcos narrowly escaped. When he got back to Mexico, Marcos spread even more rumors about a land rich in gold. But despite dozens of other Spanish treasure seekers marching north, the gold cities were never found. Do you think the cities of gold actually existed, or do you think the Spanish were just trying to mess with each other and not look bad? Let me know in the comments below. Number 3. Santokov Land. Russian merchant and explorer Yakov Santokov reported witnessing a mysterious blue fog near the New Siberian Islands in 1811. The mist appeared to be swirling around a large landmass. The explorer wanted to see more, but the weather wasn't on his side. 7 decades later, in 1886, another Russian explorer named Edward Toll witnessed the exact same thing. There was a strange island in the Arctic shrouded in a bluish haze. In 1901, Edward Toll saw it again while on a Russian polar expedition. But this time, he was determined to reach the mysterious Phantom Island on the horizon. However, just as it came within sight, Edward's ship, the Zarya, became obstructed by floating chunks of ice. The crew was stuck in the New Siberian Islands and couldn't reach the bluish fog swirling about the landmass in the distance. In November 1902, Edward Toll and 3 of his closest companions abandoned their ship and traveled on foot across the ice. They were desperate to reach the mysterious island and touch it with their own hands. Sadly, though, they vanished into the icy fog and were never seen again. Other explorers tried to discover what soon became known as Santokov Land, but all of them failed. The Soviet icebreaker Sadko went looking for it in 1936 but found absolutely no trace of it. These days, scientists don't even think it's real. Experts say the early explorers were tricked by a kind of Arctic mirage. The mystery island may have been a mirage image of the nearby Bennett Island, or maybe nothing at all but a hallucination. Number 2. The Burke and Wills Expedition. In 1860, the newly established Australian government offered a reward of £2,000 to anyone who could cross the interior of the continent. At this time, nobody except the Aborigines had ever managed to move across the vast, desolate, and dangerous Central Desert. The length of the desert is only about 2,000 miles, but it's 2,000 miles of hot misery. On August 20th, Robert O'Hara Burke, a man who had never been in the bush 1 minute in his life, set off with 19 men and 23 horses. They brought with them about 20 tons of food, including heaps of dried beef. In fact, they had so much beef that one of their wagons broke before they even got out of Melbourne's Royal Park. By September, just a month after the expedition began, people were quitting the journey. Burke's second-in-command quit, and so too did the party's surgeon. After that, William John Wills was made second in charge and had the great idea to split the expedition in half. The strongest of the horses and the strongest men planned to push to the other side of the outback, while the rest of the group kept moving along slowly. Eventually, though, they regrouped at Cooper Creek. This was the very edge of European exploration. Nobody with pasty white skin had ever gazed beyond Cooper Creek, so it was exciting for the adventurers. They should have waited until March to avoid the heat of the summer, but Burke pushed them onward. The average daily temperature during the journey was around 122 degrees Fahrenheit. What happened next is a long and painful story. The crew began to run out of supplies, and tensions were high. The men started to grow weak as their bodies were depleted of vitamins. They were so far from civilization that things started to look hopeless. There was a brief time in which a nearby Aboriginal group fed the few surviving travelers fish and beans, but it didn't do any good in the end. At some point, William John Wills sat down to rest and never got back up. Robert O'Hara Burke took a seat by a stream and slumped over dead from exhaustion. Only one man survived the journey, but he never really recovered. He ended up passing away a few years after exiting the bush, and sadly, the group never did discover how to get across the outback. Number 1. Canada's Tropical Valley. The Nahanni Valley is one of the most mysterious places in Canada. It has a reputation for murder, madness, curses, lost gold, and death. It all started with the Klondike Gold Rush at the end of the 19th century. On July 14, 1897, the steamship named the Excelsior entered San Francisco Harbor carrying frontiersmen from the north. These were gold prospectors who brought several tons of raw gold from the Klondike region. Word of what they'd found spread quickly, and men and women from everywhere got in their wagons and headed to the Klondike. The Canadian North was suddenly flooded with an estimated 20,000 gold prospectors. During the early 1900s, many of these prospectors wandered blindly through the wilderness in search of gold. This resulted in the creation of Mountie outposts, trading huts, and remote northern saloons. And in the 1920s, word began to spread of a tropical valley somewhere in the north. They were calling it an oasis in the Arctic. Prospectors Hank Russell and Jack Lee discovered a valley on the other side of a snowy mountain pass. The valley was green and warm, as if it belonged in a lush jungle somewhere in Asia. And the heat was so intense in the valley, it was like being in the mouth of a volcano. Then, on June 26, 1925, the Alaska Weekly published an article titled "The Valley of Eden." It was all about how a mining engineer from Vancouver named Frank Perry spent 17 years exploring the subarctic with his dogs. And he, too, came upon the vast paradise sheltered in the mountains. The Paradise Valley of Canada has never been discovered, although some think it could be the Nahanni Valley, which is located about 300 miles west of the city of Yellowknife. The valley is said to be home to headless men and spirits of ancient Native American groups. It's a spooky place, though certainly not tropical. The truth of the tropical valley is still out there. We just haven't found it yet. Thanks for watching. Would you ever volunteer to join an expedition into the unknown? Let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and come back soon. Bye!